Would you rather spend a lifetime in the quietest room on Earth with 99.9% noise reduction, and where the quiet can become disorienting and may even cause you to hallucinate? Or would you rather spend a lifetime immersed in a noisy city with sound levels above 60 decibels at all times, where you might not even be able to hear your own thoughts? Now, we present to you a rather impossible choice, as each scenario is not ideal and can greatly impact your lifestyle, health, and psychological state. So what is the perfect auditory balance? What other senses contribute to our experience of noise? And how do architects and designers better analyze the nuanced user experiences of today to develop spaces that are comfortable and functional? I'm your guest host, Jessica Jenkins, and this is The Learning Objective, a podcast for the architecture and design community where you can earn continuing education credit for listening. In today's episode, you'll learn how architects and designers can up their awareness on all senses, especially auditory, to design inclusively and immersively, providing higher levels of comfort and function for the everyday user. In part one, we'll hear from Steve Orfield, researcher and president at Orfield Labs, as he analyzes multisensory experiences and the impact on human cognitive behavior and perception. And in part two, we'll meet with Evan Benway, managing director at Moodsonic, to evaluate one specific sense, our auditory sense, looking at a newer development, soundscaping, and the challenges and advantages of manipulating sound to benefit the user experience. But before we dive in, here's today's CEU provider and sponsor, Funk, to share the learning objectives. Later in the episode, you'll hear instructions on how to obtain credit for listening.
G'day, I'm Angus Blakelock with Baresque. After listening to today's episode, you'll be able to, first, examine the multisensory factors that contribute to noise. Second, identify a key principle of universal design. Third, evaluate the psychological effects of auditory noise on human behaviour and well-being. And fourth, investigate the role of soundscaping on the user experience.
I'm Steve Orfield with Orfield Laboratories in Minneapolis. We're a 50-year-old design research lab, the world's only multi-sensory design research lab in architecture. And that means we work in acoustics and audiovisual, in lighting and daylighting and thermal comfort and indoor air quality. We work in architecture. We work in product development. We work in forensics. We do subjective, objective research across the different domains.
To conduct acoustic and multisensory research, you need controlled environments. Steve tells us about his lab's anechoic chamber, or as the Guinness Book of World Records calls it, the quietest place on Earth.
The intent for anechoic chambers is a research intent. The anechoic chamber is a 99.9% absorbent room. Most acoustical labs have a couple of reverberation chambers for testing sound transmission. They test sound absorption. They test sound power. But an anechoic chamber is a dead room. It's the opposite of a reverb room, where a reverb room is 100% reflective. An anechoic chamber is 100% absorbent. And it's very good for investigating issues when you're trying to figure out why a product is producing the amount of noise that it is, if you're trying to figure out where the sound is coming from, if you're trying to localize things, because an anechoic chamber localizes to the sound where you are.
You'll hear more about anechoic chambers as we look at silence on the user experience with Evan Benway in the second half of this episode. But first, Steve shares with us what his lab encourages those that visit to think about. And spoiler, designing to treat noise is not only about acoustics.
What we've tried to teach people who come to visit our chamber is that silence isn't about noise. There is noise in every domain. Noise in lighting is glare. Noise in the thermal environment is draft. Noise in the olfactory environment is odors. In every dimension of human perception, we have noise. And what we've been aiming at by going into all these areas of perception is to create spaces and to create products that are silent across all the different domains, so that the products or the environments are much more peaceful. They tend to relax people more. They tend to make people more at ease.
Most of us hear the word noise and think immediately of acoustics, and we know that it's an important factor to design for. But our traditional architectural and design methods still tend to focus heavily on the visual components. Steve shares ways that architecture and design firms can reduce noise in all domains, for better cognitive and perceptual experiences. And a key to this is expanding where we focus our traditional methods.
Well, first expand their horizon from the visual side of design, which is the center of most design, to all of the sensory issues in design. Secondly, understand that all the sensory issues that people experience are multipliers of each other. As you get sound in an environment, you also get lighting in the environment, you also get thermal environment in the environment. And each of those things builds on each other and tends to stimulate you. And in many cases, you also design an environment that's visually complex because you want to do interesting design. And so between all the visual complexity, all the cognitive complexity, all the perceptual complexity, many of these environments overwhelm people without intending to. What we try to teach people is to back off and to say everything's about signal to noise. Everything you see because of a contrast with something else. And the more things that are in your field of view, the fewer things you actually notice. Like the Italians, when they design an all-white room, and at the other end of the room, they put one red rose on a white table. You always notice that red rose because you don't have everything competing with it. And what we tend to do in design around the world is we tend to put so much detail into design that it becomes overly complex for people's cognitive systems, and it makes it more difficult for any of the things that you designed to stand out versus anything else.
The buzzwords of immersive design and inclusive design or universal design, can they actually complement one another? Where many think immersive must mean all senses stimulated at once. In fact, it can mean quite the contrary. Immersive should be where all senses are cohesively acknowledged to the point of maybe noise reduction in all fields, so the users can focus on what they were intentionally meant to experience. While that still may vary by user, it's this extreme attention to detail that makes for an immersive experience and one that leads to an automatically inclusive environment. As a cognitive researcher with over 50 years of experience, Steve takes it one step further and explains what universal design really means.
There's a lot of talk about universal design, which is design that will suit most any user, which ideally will suit most any perceptual disability. Designing things that suit people quite automatically. And if you overlay normal human factors practice, that means designing things that don't need instruction manuals, designing things that don't need someone to teach you how to use it, that are so obvious in their design, in their function, and use so many normal human metaphors that you can walk up to them and just do what you need to do.
He shares an example of how universal design application can be tested with products and spaces alike, and how a test from over 40 years ago still applies today.
40 years ago, we designed 3M's Human Factors Laboratory, and the whole idea was to roll a device into that laboratory without any instructions on it, for example, like a copier, and ask people to make copies and collate the copies and staple the copies, but without any instructions. And they worked on those copiers until, in fact, people could do that without a single word on the copier. They could make it work. So there's brilliance in extremely simple design that's based on the metaphors that we all know as human beings, rather than trying to develop and engineer new ways of running things that people don't know.
Yet simplifying down to an automatic response level is not an easy feat. Steve shares one way architects and designers can do this throughout space.
Everything is about getting enough detail to communicate something, but not getting so much that you confuse the communication. What we tend to do in design is we tend to overdo the visual side of design, underdo the other sides of design, and not realize that we're always in a three-dimensional environment where all kinds of things are coming at us. And what we really need to do good design is we need to throttle them back so the user can relax.
By upping our design awareness on every sensory domain, we can reduce the noise to allow for the user to detect, recognize, scale, and make decisions about space in the way that we want them to. If you've ever designed wayfinding, you'll appreciate this approach.
What we're always trying to do is we're always trying to get people to notice things. As you go through the perceptual chain of realizing that something is there, you detect it, you recognize it, you scale it, and you make decisions about it. And until you've gone through those 4 steps, it really isn't in your continuum. If we create environments that are simple enough, we allow people the elegance of going through that process of recognizing things, scaling them, drawing judgments about them, and basically relaxing in their own natural mode. When we make environments that are too complex, essentially we're giving people a problem they need to solve, like the problem of wayfinding. So when we design buildings for wayfinding, we're constantly trying to design them so the building is a self-guiding building and it's not confusing and it's not disorienting. It's not overly based on signage because people don't tend to read signage very well. But basically, when you walk into the building, you get an overall sense of what it's about, where it's going, and you really don't find yourself having to learn the navigation symbolism of that particular building. And yet, what we're doing in architecture these days is making architecture more complicated, more non-symmetric, and more perceptually confusing and very confusing from a wayfinding standpoint.
By reducing the complexity, you are inherently designing for a more universal experience. And it is no surprise that in turn benefits all. With Steve's 25 years studying invisible disabilities, he found that the best design approach is to use universal as the standard, without necessarily declaring it for one demographic or one group over another.
I've spent 25 years of my life studying invisible disabilities, which are things like aging, dementia, autism, PTSD, ADHD, sensory processing disorder, blindness, deafness. I would ask all of the different nonprofit organizations, how many invisible disability people are there in the world? And they really didn't know. So we did an aggregation ourselves and found out that over half of everybody has invisible disabilities. And so 10 years ago, we stopped designing buildings that didn't consider disabilities, these invisible disabilities, perceptual and cognitive disabilities. And we've not since that time asked our clients whether they want us to do this. We just do it because we know it's appropriate. So we automatically designed for invisible disabilities. We automatically design buildings so that they're simpler. So wherever we have the control over the acoustics, the lighting, the daylighting, the thermal comfort, the indoor air quality, which we usually do on our major projects, we just immediately go to new versions of design that take the pressure off of the people who have these disabilities. And in the process of doing that, we create buildings that are much more friendly for people who are neurotypical or don't have disabilities. So the interesting thing, in contrast to what many in the design community believe, is if you're designing for autism, if you design right, you're designing for all of us. If you design for dementia, if you do it right, you're designing for all of us. If you design for mental illness, if you do it right, you're designing for all of us.
The ideal universal design takes the sensory pressure off people, a new level of attention to user experience. And Steve shares how to take that pressure off.
Focus on people because people are the only reason you're in the business. People are your user. And learn how to measure people, not qualitatively by talking to them, but quantitatively by testing them.
And lastly, we asked Steve, how can architects, designers, firms, and the whole industry expand our people research?
Many architectural firms do qualitative postdocs, which we tease them for because if you don't do a pre-doc, a postdoc has no value. They use qualitative methods because that's what they've learned in design school. What they should be learning is quantitative methods because qualitative research is essentially opinion-based research. It's like doing a focus group or a design charrette. And it teaches you what people are saying. It teaches you what they're thinking, but it has no predictive value. In other words, it's shown to have no scientific value if you're trying to predict whether people will like something in the end. For quantitative research, which is closed-in research where you're using semantic terms like high quality, low quality, beautiful, not beautiful, whatever the emotional term is, that kind of research is highly predictive of your future behavior. So if you do quantitative research correctly, you can measure people, you can measure environments, and you can correlate them in ways that will help you to understand what people unconsciously really want, not what they say they want, but what they really want. And so if we can get to that point, we can start to produce buildings that long before they go into the ground will know that people will love them.
Steve taught us through extensive years of research how reducing the noise in all sensory domains can greatly benefit the user experience across all cognitive levels. Now we take that 100,000-foot view and narrow it down to one of our senses, specifically auditory. We'll meet with Evan Benway about turning up our awareness on sound, both the benefits and the downfalls.
My name's Evan Benway. I'm managing director of Moodsonic. My background really starts with sound and continues through to the present. Both of my parents were musicians. My father's a classical pianist. My mother's a cellist. I grew up learning various instruments, and I'm a sort of jazz musician in my spare time when I can do it. So I always thought a lot about sound experience pretty sensitively. Ultimately, it was when I was first confronted with an open plan office working in a large technology company in California that created some conflict for me. My sensitivity to sound and my job, which was on the innovation side of the business and involved a lot of focus, writing patents and creating technology and things like that. The conflict that came about between my need for focus and what that environment provided was what brought me into the world of soundscaping.
A beautiful beginning to auditory experiences, yet confronted with the reality of acoustic noise. We asked Evan to tell us more about what soundscaping is and isn't.
I might start by defining two terms that can get mixed up. Soundscape, that generally refers to what one hears around oneself in a given environment, in a given moment. Right now, what I hear around myself, I'm in my home office. It's a rainy day in Austria. I hear some rain. That's more or less the soundscape that I'm in. If you were in a corner of an intersection in New York City, your soundscape would be much louder, much more intense, punctuate cars honking their horns, things like that. And there are a number of standards in process being proposed, different methods of characterizing the soundscapes of given environments. So that's soundscape. Soundscaping is adding sound into environments to bring about some kind of effect. Generally, we're focused on positive things. We are primarily focused on workplaces, hospitals, and schools, environments that historically have big noise problems, but we're also adding sound is a really useful tool for designing for focus, designing for engagement, creating more inviting spaces, things like that.
With Steve, we learned the value of minimizing noise on all 5 sensory levels. With Evan, we asked, what is one reason we should be rethinking our approach to sound?
Sound is the number one thing that people complain about in indoor spaces, offices, hospitals, et cetera. It's the number one thing people complain about, which is amazing. Why is that? Well, we're very sensitive to sound, and not all of our brains are the same. Some of us are more or less sensitive, but generally speaking, we've got cognitive bandwidth for 1.6 conversations at any given moment. That means the conversation that we're having, it's taking up most of my bandwidth. And if I was trying to focus on something else, I really wouldn't be able to. We're not good at doing work in the presence of speech. This is one of the reasons that it's such a complaint indoors. Also, our hearing is evolved really as an alarm system and can go immediately to the emotional centers of our brain. It can trigger a fight or flight response. Think of the rattlesnake sound, and quickly that can change your perspective, your behavior. Our sense of hearing evolved as an alarm system, and we're particularly good at picking up on communication. So all of these things have caused it to be a frustration.
With noise being a top complaint, it's imperative for our industry to turn up our awareness on that design element. But it's not all doom and gloom when it comes to sound.
That said, that's sort of the sad state of things. If we focus then on the positive side of things, I would say, think of a piece of music that you really love, right? That moves you. You can remember sort of the emotions that you associate with that piece of music. Is really powerful and beautiful stuff. Music, however, is really subjective. So it's a difficult tool to design with, but it at least sort of hints at the opportunity within sound to create experiences that are good. And generally speaking, we know that there's a lot of benefit to be found in biophilia, so sounds based on nature. I used the rattlesnake example earlier, so the sounds of nature are not all uniformly good. Even a sound like birdsong, which has been shown in some studies to be very powerful, improve creative thinking, mitigate loneliness, increase feelings of safety. It can also drive people crazy if you get it done wrong. But generally speaking, those types of sounds, there's a lot of powerful potential. Generally speaking, it's very good for us from a well-being perspective and can be used by architects, by designers to complement their visual designs, to augment what's being done visually with that sonic power. If you walk into a space where what you see and what you hear are aligned and all designed in a nice way, you can create really powerful, good results that way too.
Design in general can be subjective and personal, and sound is no different. So how does one begin to incorporate it intentionally and in a cohesive way that works with all other visual and sensory elements? We asked Evan to share some examples of positive projects.
The best project, they've thought about it from the very beginning and have designed with sound in mind as they've gone along, but that's not very common. Sound has typically been this thing that people complain about, and the suggestions from the Acoustic and audio community generally have been really important. You want to remediate noise. You want to cut down on reflections. Acoustics is very important to do, but there hasn't been a lot of focus on how sound can be designed in. So it's not surprising that architects and designers haven't used that a lot historically. I can give you an example of a project where this was done exceptionally well. One was in India, large multinational technology firm. They built a beautiful space in northern India based on northern Indian nature, based on the Himalaya mountains. And when you step into the reception, you can see the mountain slopes, and it's as though you're sort of in this mountainous setting. And the soundscape that we designed for that particular space complements that. You have northern Himalayan birdsong, for example. They have a monsoon room, so a room that's designed for quiet, focused work, but where the visual design really channels the monsoon. It's not designed to be like stormy and overwhelming, but actually with really very gentle rainfall in that room. We're using the sounds of the tanpura, a northern Indian classical drone, and it creates a very quiet, focused space. As you can imagine, what you see, what you hear, it's all very aligned.
Whether sound is designed at the forefront or, let's face it, incorporated after, it always comes back to the people and the user experience.
It can also be a simple retrofit. Most of the projects, we don't have that type of vision incorporated from the beginning. And so typically we're going into a space where the visual design is more or less planned. It's a slightly different set of questions that are asked. The job from the perspective of the soundscape designer is really to understand what are the use cases for this building? What are the user journeys that are being thought about? We may have designed spaces that are collaboration, other spaces that are about focus. We want to ensure that the sound system is going to support those types of activities. Also, what are the different types of people using this space? Do we have an organization that's 80% software engineers? That tells us people are going to come in and have a need for deep, focused work. We're going to design for that. Or conversely, do we have sort of the stereotypical sales team? Do we have those two teams sharing one open space? Those are then the types of inputs that would go into the design of the sound system so that you're supporting those different types of activities.
While user questions may give us good qualitative research, a standard for our industry, Evan shares with us a quantitative study done by Goldsmith University of London, where they measured the physiological response to biophilic sounds.
Sound is really powerful stuff. I talked a lot about the sad story, but the positive side of things, the benefits, they're also really profound. Most of what we do is really R&D. We've got thousands of people across the world experiencing soundscaping. So we're constantly looking at their experiences, how they interact with sound, what works and doesn't. We worked with a team from Goldsmiths University of London. They measured EEG, brain waves, heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, this full suite of physiological measurements. So generally speaking, nature-based or biophilic soundscapes can relax people. What we saw there was increased alpha wave activity. So that's generally accepted to indicate good things, improved creative performance, for example. We saw heart rate slowing, respiration slowing. They can aid in restoration. These types of sounds can support and improve well-being. The flip side of that coin is actually related to that. As people relax, what we then see is improved cognitive performance.
As people relax, their cognitive performance improved. A key element that Steve had mentioned earlier in this episode was to design in a way that allowed people to take the pressure off. Evan goes in further detail about the benefits of this relaxed state.
Every now and then we've had a sort of cynical person who says, hey, this is an office we're designing for. We don't want people to go to sleep here. That's never happened, by the way. We've never seen someone fall asleep in an office. But what we do see is that as people relax and as attention is restored, cognitive performance goes up. In studies that have looked at cognitive performance, and that's a pretty big bucket, using peer-reviewed methodology, measuring cognitive output on standard tasks, we see improvements on the order of 20%. With creativity, you see significant improvements in collaboration as well, upwards of 10%. So generally speaking, we can see well-being improved. We see productivity improved. One that's probably equally as meaningful for a lot of our clients is that people then spend more time in spaces that have been soundscaped. Kind of makes sense. This has been known in retail for a while. People avoid places that have bad sound. They go to and will spend more time in, therefore spend more money in spaces that sound good. And sort of the same thing really applies in designing a workspace or any other type of environment. If you can create an environment that's more comfortable for people to be in, they'll spend more time there. So those are some of the key things we see.
Evan mentioned the comfort of being in a space. We'll take it one step further, looking at the Well Building Standard that focuses on comfort as a key component. And one notable mention around comfort is while there isn't a max sound requirement, there is a minimum sound requirement when it comes to well.
So as it currently stands, they specify minimum background sound levels and will award credits to a project that has achieved minimum background sound levels. What's that all about? If sound is this big problem, as we established before, shouldn't the goal be just to eliminate sound and make spaces as silent as possible? The problem with that line of thinking is that silence is really not a good design goal for us.
Evan takes us back to our anechoic chambers and the experience in the quietest place on earth.
If you have a chance, go into an anechoic chamber. These are rooms that are designed to be one of the quietest places on earth. So you can go into these places that are supremely quiet. And chances are you can't spend a lot of time there. People don't do well in those environments. You can look on YouTube and see who's beat the latest Guinness Book of World Records for longest time spent in an anechoic chamber. It was like a couple of hours last time I checked. At that point, people are falling out of their chairs. They're like becoming unconscious.
We checked. The record time in an anechoic chamber is currently 65 minutes. And funny enough, the record was beat in Steve Orfield's anechoic chamber in Minnesota, deemed the quietest place by the Guinness Book of World Records. And what do you hear in the chamber? As one user said, you'll hear your heart beating. Sometimes you can hear your lungs. In the anechoic chamber, you become the sound.
Supreme silence is really unnatural. And I live in Austria. You can get out into the mountains and to a lot of parts of this country that are really distant from human-made sounds, but they're not silent. You hear something coming from nature almost always. And silence is actually quite uncomfortable. Other sounds, the sound of the Pacific Ocean, for example, you can get 65, 70 decibels from a sound pressure level meter there. It's quite loud, but it's not a problem, right? People are drawn to that. So a decibel level in and of itself doesn't tell you everything. Silence, particularly in an office where Well has been concerned with it, creates a few problems. Most offices are too quiet to be comfortable and to be productive. The problem being someone picks up a phone call or unzips a backpack. Any sound in a very silent space is going to be a major event. It's going to catch our attention.
While true silence may not be the ideal, reducing noise in all domains, particularly auditory, is increasing with the overstimulation we have with space and technology.
Our attention's constantly under assault from technology and from just the sounds of the worlds that we're in. That's a problem to be solved. So Well has recognized that and has some basic specifications. If you're designing an open plan space, the minimum background level is a target I think that's pretty good, and that would cut down on distracting speech, for example, that would provide a bit more privacy for people environments. They have slightly different levels for a quiet space, like a focus room or something like that, recognizing that silence isn't really a design goal and that people do need some minimum background level of sound to be able to be productive.
Beyond just applying the minimum background level of noise, Evan discusses what's on the horizon for auditory experiences.
I think creating sonic environments that are suitably immersive for people in spaces, that's a major focus and a major opportunity. I think that obviously there's a lot of talk happening about AI, and not to just sort of add to that echo chamber, but there's tremendous potential in how sound is generated these days in generative AI. Certainly something that we've been spending a lot of time looking into and implementing. Having sound that's generative, that's non-looping, that doesn't become an annoyance, and that can flex and change as the environment does is so critically important. We were thinking about that, and we knew that prior to this pandemic, that it was difficult to predict when it would be loud, when it would be quiet, when do you have a lot of collaboration happening in the space. That just continues to change all the time, right? There's so much change and experimentation happening in workplace right now. And so having sound that's able to flex, be responsive, and be generative, that's very exciting to me.
Evan shares a critical piece of why breaking that continuous loop of sound is important, and why leaning on experts when adding elements like sound or any other stimuli needs data and a keen understanding of the impact it has on users.
While we're on this notion of looping and that being annoying, this can be true of biophilic sound too. And we found in a study that was conducted in an open office plan with about 100 open office workers that without telling people what we were doing, people in that space were able to identify a week-long loop of a nature sound. And they were able to say, okay, it's Thursday, 9:30 a.m. I'm going to hear that bird again and I'm going to lose it. And it wasn't all 100 people, but it was a few people. It really bothered them. We're these amazing pattern recognizers, humans, and we pick up on loops. Sound can't do that. So having sound that's generative, that's responsive, and frankly, that's well-designed is actually really important, because as much as I'm advocating for introducing sound and for the soundscaping approach, it has to be done well, or you're just going to drive people crazy. And that's certainly not one of our goals.
Lastly, we asked Evan to give our listeners advice on how to successfully design with auditory at the forefront.
I think don't be scared to think about adding sound to a space in a way that can benefit people, right? Sound can be so much more than just noise. It can really promote well-being in the ways that we discussed. You can actually improve people's respiration and heart rates. So this can be really good for us, can create much more inviting, engaging spaces that are better aligned with all the other major trends in architecture. So I think sounds is really a great opportunity for architects and designers to think about. And obviously there's some detail that matters there, and it has to be done well. I mean, thinking about the neurodiverse landscape, we don't all have the same brains and we respond to sound very differently. When you look at the neurodiverse population generally in offices or other buildings, they are the least well-served by typical approaches to sound. But also that's where the opportunity really is as well, to better serve people who are neurodiverse. Whereas to generalize as a group of people on the autistic spectrum are more easily overstimulated. The soundscape method gives you this great toolkit with which to provide different degrees of stimulation, different options for the different types of people inhabiting these offices. So I'd say let's give it a shot. Don't be scared.
Here's our episode sponsor to close out the episode.
Step into a world where spaces empower you. At Funk, we harness design's transformative power to enhance human experiences by creating spaces that blend functional aesthetics with user well-being. Just like the stories you've heard here, Funk values our environment's impact, crafting acoustic solutions that foster focus, comfort, and well-being with purpose-driven sound management. Funk, where innovative acoustic design transforms spaces.
To obtain credit for listening, simply visit the show notes of this episode and click the link to take a short quiz. Thanks for listening and learning with us today. The Learning Objective is a Surround Podcast Network original production. Check out more shows from Surround at surroundpodcast.com. This episode of The Learning Objective was produced and edited by Sandow Design Group. Special thanks to the podcast production team, Hannah Vitti, Rob Schulte, and Rachel Senatori.